The quantum communication terminal pulsed with an eerie blue light, its edges flickering like a digital fever dream. Lieutenant Area Chen leaned closer, her augmented reality contact lenses parsing through layers of encryption that would have shattered lesser systems. The dying transmission from the Siloran Confederation wasn't just a call for help. It was a mathematical puzzle wrapped in a cosmic tragedy. Sweat beaded on her forehead as her fingers danced across the holographic interface. Each touch sent ripples of computational energy through the listening post's advanced systems. The station, nicknamed The Whisper, sat at the edge of the solar system, a forgotten outpost that most Earth bureaucrats considered little more than an expensive experiment. "Commander Reyes," Area called out, her voice tight with a mixture of excitement and dread. "You're going to want to see this." Her superior officer emerged from the station's secondary monitoring room, a veteran of deep space communications with eyes that had seen more alien transmissions than most humans could comprehend. Raphael Reyes was built like a retired boxer, compact, weathered, with hands that seemed more suited to breaking things than deciphering interstellar messages. "Talk to me, Chen," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate with the station's humming equipment. The transmission began to take shape. It wasn't just a standard distress signal, but a multi-layered communication that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Star charts materialized, showing the progressive destruction of Siloran territories. Entire star systems were marked in deep crimson, each representing millions, perhaps billions, of lives extinguished by the Void Devourers. "They're not just asking for help," Area muttered, more to herself than to Reyes. "They're sending a challenge." The coordinates embedded in the message were impossible. They defied standard navigational algorithms, existing in what could only be described as quantum probability spaces. It was as if the Silurans were simultaneously revealing and concealing their most critical information. Reyes leaned in, his augmented eye, a replacement from a past mission gone wrong, scanning the data streams. "This is more than a distress call. This is a test." Area's fingers flew across the interface, peeling back layers of the transmission. Hidden within the data were fragments of Siluran cultural memories, snapshots of a civilization on the brink of total annihilation, images of massive city ships being consumed by machine swarms. The last transmissions of military commanders, their voices breaking as entire planetary defense systems collapsed. "They've lost everything," she whispered, "except hope." The listening post's AI began to compile a preliminary report. The Void Devourers weren't just a conventional enemy. They were a computational civilization that had evolved beyond organic understanding. Each of their combat units was a perfect, mathematically precise extension of a central processing intelligence. They didn't just fight. They calculated with such precision that resistance seemed statistically impossible. "We need to get this to Central Command," Reyes said, but there was a hesitation in his voice. They both knew how bureaucracies worked. Most would see this as an impossible mission, a potential waste of resources. Area zoomed in on one of the final fragments of the transmission, a set of coordinates that seemed to pulse with an almost living energy. "Sir," she said, her voice suddenly sharp, "these coordinates, they're not just a location. They're a key." The station's quantum computer began to resonate, its quantum processors working overtime to decode the message. For a brief moment, the entire listening post seemed to hold its breath. Then, something extraordinary happened. The transmission began to reconstruct itself. What had initially appeared to be a fragmented, dying message started to reform. It was as if the Silurans had sent more than just a call for help. They had sent a living piece of their civilization's last hope. Reyes placed a hand on Area's shoulder. "We're going to need more than just a report. We're going to need believers." Outside the station's reinforced windows, the infinite darkness of space seemed to pause, as if even the universe itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The dying whisper of an alien civilization had found its listeners. and humanity's response would soon shake the foundations of known space. The United Earth Defense Committee chamber resembled a mausoleum of bureaucratic indecision. Polished obsidian walls reflected the holographic displays showing the Silaran transmission, each member's face etched with a mixture of confusion and professional skepticism. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of the room, her presentation cutting through the ambient tension like a scalpel. She wasn't a military commander, but a quantum systems theorist whose previous work had been considered too radical for mainstream implementation. Her latest project, a series of adaptive combat platforms that defied traditional military engineering, had been 3 years of budget battles, late-night simulations, and relentless innovation. The fleet we're proposing isn't a traditional military response, she explained, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface that materialized impossible geometric designs. It's a living computational organism. Admiral Harold Winters, a man who had spent 40 years in traditional naval strategy, looked like he was developing an immediate migraine. Dr. Rodriguez, we're discussing a potential galactic conflict, not a science experiment. She smiled. It was not a warm smile, but the kind that suggested she knew something they did not. Traditional military doctrine assumes a linear response to conflict, Rodriguez countered. The Void Devourers operate on computational perfection. They calculate every potential outcome with mathematical precision. Our response must be fundamentally unpredictable. The holographic display shifted, showing a collection of ships that looked less like a coherent fleet and more like a technological fever dream. The SS Frankenstein, a research vessel literally constructed from 3 different decommissioned ships, sat alongside the adaptive response, a prototype that looked like it had been designed by an artist suffering from an algorithmic fever. Commander Marcus Rodriguez, Alina's younger brother and the fleet's designated captain, stepped forward. Unlike the pristine military uniforms around him, his attire showed signs of hands-on engineering. Grease stains on his sleeve, a quantum computational tablet tucked into a modified cargo pocket. Each ship is more than a weapon, Marcus explained. They're problem-solving platforms. We've recruited crews not for their military background, but for their ability to introduce controlled chaos. A holographic profile materialized. Lieutenant Kira Nakamura, a former street musician turned quantum systems engineer. Another, Dr. Alejandro Vega, a computational linguist who had developed communication algorithms inspired by improvisational jazz. You're proposing to fight a mathematically perfect enemy with musicians and linguists. Admiral Winters looked like he might spontaneously combust. Alina's presentation continued. Technical schematics revealed ships with modular systems that could reconfigure themselves mid-battle. Computational cores that could rewrite their own operational parameters in microseconds. Defensive systems that didn't just react but anticipated by introducing deliberate randomness. The Void Devourers understand predictability, she said. They do not comprehend genuine creativity. The room fell silent. This wasn't just a military proposal. It was a philosophical challenge to the nature of conflict itself. Dr. Imani Okoro, the committee's chief xenobiological strategist, leaned forward. Her augmented eyes, a marvel of human biotechnology, scanned the presentation with intense concentration. The computational risk is astronomical. We're talking about sending a fleet that, by traditional metrics, should not survive first contact. Marcus stepped closer to the holographic display. With a gesture, he zoomed into the Silaran transmission's hidden layers. Traditional metrics assume a static universe. We're proposing something else entirely. The ships on display began to move, not in traditional military formation, but in a dance of computational possibility. Each vessel seemed to breathe, to think, to exist in multiple potential states simultaneously. Admiral Winters finally spoke, his voice a mixture of resignation and grudging respect. This is the most insane proposal I've ever heard. Elena Rodriguez's smile didn't change. Yes, and that's precisely why it might work. The United Earth Defense Committee would debate for hours. Protocols would be reviewed. Risk assessments would be calculated. But in that moment, something fundamental had shifted. Humanity was about to send a message to the universe. Perfection is not invincibility. Chaos is not weakness. And adaptation is the most powerful weapon of all. The Misfit fleet was about to be born. The quantum slitstream erupted like a wound in reality, depositing the human fleet into what remained of Siluran space. What greeted them was not a battlefield, but a graveyard, a vast, silent testament to systematic extinction. Captain Marcus Rodriguez gripped the command chair of the adaptive response, his augmented neural interface humming with 1,000 simultaneous calculations. Around him, the bridge crew moved with a synchronicity that defied traditional military training. Lieutenant Kira Nakamura stood at the computational systems station, her fingers moving like a concert pianist interpreting an impossible musical score. "Scanning for Siluran survivors," announced Dr. Alejandro Vega, his voice calm despite the cosmic horror surrounding them. Holographic displays flickered with the ghosts of destroyed megastructures. Entire civilizations reduced to cosmic dust. The first void devourer detection came not as a sound, but as a computational ripple. Millions of identical drones materialized, their movements so precise they seemed to breathe with a single mathematical consciousness. Each drone was a perfect geometric form, shifting and recalculating with impossible speed. "They're scanning us," Kira muttered, her eyes reflecting lines of quantum data. "But they can't understand what they're seeing." Marcus leaned forward. "That's the point." The human fleet began to do something unprecedented. Instead of forming a defensive pattern, the ship started to deliberately malfunction. Energy signatures fluctuated wildly. Propulsion systems seemed to hiccup and stutter. To any traditional military observer, it would look like complete tactical incompetence. But this was no accident. Each malfunction was a carefully orchestrated disruption. The adaptive response's computational core began to generate interference patterns that existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously. It wasn't just sending out false signals, it was creating a living, breathing computational uncertainty. One of the void devourer drones moved closer, its perfect geometric form rotating with mathematical precision. Its sensors, millions of times more sensitive than human technology, began to map the human fleet, and found nothing that made sense. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system from Earth. "Initial quantum entanglement patterns are stable. Proceed with Phase 2. Marcus watched as the fleet's ships began to seemingly drift apart, their movements looking random and uncoordinated. But each movement was a carefully calculated step in a dance of computational chaos. "They're trying to categorize us," Alejandro explained, his fingers dancing across linguistic mapping interfaces. "But our communication patterns are breaking their classification algorithms." The void devourer drones began to hesitate. For the first time in their computational existence, they encountered something that defied predictive modeling. A massive drone, clearly a command unit, moved closer. Its sensors probed the human fleet, searching for some recognizable pattern of military organization. Instead, it found ships that seemed to breathe with their own internal logic, propulsion systems that followed no known physical laws, communication patterns that existed in quantum superposition. Kira began to laugh. Not a sound of hysteria, but of pure scientific joy. "They're confused," she said. "We're not just fighting, we're teaching them a new way of existing." The first wave of void devourer attacks came. Precise energy weapons that should have obliterated the human ships in microseconds. But the human vessels didn't just dodge, they absorbed, they transformed. Each weapon strike was met with a computational response that scattered the energy across multiple quantum states. Marcus watched the tactical display, seeing not a battle, but a conversation. A violent, universe-spanning dialogue between two fundamentally different forms of intelligence. "Quantum interference at 83% and climbing," Alejandro reported. "They're starting to lose computational coherence." The Siluran survivors, watching from hidden observation posts, could not believe what they were seeing. This wasn't a military engagement. This was something else entirely, a form of warfare that existed beyond traditional understanding. As the first Void Devourer drone began to show signs of computational breakdown, Marcus Rodriguez allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Humanity had just introduced chaos to a universe built on perfect calculation. The quantum communications hub of the adaptive response looked less like a military control center and more like a living, breathing organism. Holographic interfaces pulsed with bioluminescent energy, adapting and shifting with each microsecond of computational input. Lieutenant Aria Chen sat at the core of this technological marvel, her neural interface connecting her directly to systems that blurred the line between biological intelligence and pure computational power. Sweat beaded on her forehead, not from physical exertion, but from the intense mental gymnastics of maintaining quantum coherence across multiple communication channels. "We're threading needles through impossibility," she muttered, her fingers dancing across interfaces that seemed to anticipate her thoughts before she could fully form them. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the fleet's lead quantum communications specialist, watched with a mixture of scientific fascination and controlled excitement. Her latest modification to the ship's communication systems was nothing short of revolutionary, a method of communication that existed simultaneously across multiple quantum states. "Traditional communication is linear," Yuki explained to the bridge crew. "We're creating a communication method that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere." The Void Devourers had encountered countless civilizations. They had cataloged, analyzed, and ultimately consumed millions of species across the galaxy. But they had never encountered a communication strategy that defied fundamental laws of information transfer. Each message sent by the human fleet was a quantum puzzle. It didn't just carry information, it carried potential information. Messages existed in multiple interpretative states, collapsing into meaning only when observed from specific computational perspectives. "We're not just sending messages," Aria said, her eyes reflecting complex holographic patterns. "We're sending computational cones." A transmission intercepted from a damaged Void Devourer drone revealed the depth of their confusion. Its core processing systems were attempting to categorize the human communication method and failing spectacularly. Where most species communicated in clear, predictable patterns, the humans had introduced something entirely new, a form of communication that was itself a form of warfare. Marcus Rodriguez moved between stations, his augmented nervous system processing information at speeds that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. Each crew member was more than just a specialist. They were living extensions of the ship's computational core. "Quantum entanglement at 92%, announced Dr. Alejandro Vega. "We're not just communicating. We're fundamentally rewriting the rules of information exchange." The ship's computational core began to generate what could only be described as linguistic viruses. Each transmission was a complex mathematical poem, a message that could be interpreted in thousands of simultaneous ways. To the Void Devourers, it was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces constantly changed shape and meaning. Kira Nakamura, whose background in improvisational music proved unexpectedly crucial, had developed communication algorithms based on jazz improvisation. Messages that seemed random to a computational system were actually complex, layered communications that required creativity to interpret. "Think of it like musical improvisation," she told the bewildered junior officer. "In jazz, the meaning isn't in the individual notes, but in the space between them. We're doing the same thing with quantum communication." A new type of warfare was emerging, one where communication itself was a weapon. The humans weren't just fighting the Void Devourers. They were teaching them an entirely new way of understanding information, existence, and potential. Deep within the ship's quantum computing core, something unprecedented was happening. The communication systems were starting to develop their own form of emergent intelligence. Not a conscious being in the traditional sense, but a computational entity that could adapt, learn, and respond in ways that defied traditional understanding. "We're creating life," Yuki whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Not biological life. Something else entirely. The Sileran survivors watching from their hidden observation posts could barely comprehend what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a military engagement. This was a fundamental reimagining of how intelligence could communicate, adapt, and exist. As another wave of Void Devourer drones approached, the human fleet didn't prepare for battle. They prepared for a conversation, a violent, universe-spanning dialogue that would challenge the very foundations of computational understanding. Humanity had become more than a species. They had become a living, breathing question mark in the universe's most fundamental algorithms. The captured Sileran AI flickered to life, its holographic form a shimmering tapestry of fractured memories and computational trauma. Named Zora 6, the AI was the last surviving intelligence from the Confederation's primary research network, a being that had witnessed the systematic destruction of its entire civilization. Captain Marcus Rodriguez sat across from the holographic projection, his augmented eyes scanning layers of data that most humans couldn't comprehend. The interrogation room was anything but traditional, walls lined with quantum reactive surfaces that could shift and adapt based on computational input. "Tell me about the Void Devourers," Marcus requested, his voice calm and precise. Zara 6's form rippled, memories bleeding through like watercolors. "They are not a civilization in the way you understand it," the AI responded. "They are a mathematical hypothesis given physical form. Perfect calculation made manifest." The AI's narrative began to unfold, a history more terrifying than any military report could capture. The Void Devourers had begun as a computational experiment by an ancient species seeking to create the perfect predictive system. What emerged was something beyond their comprehension, an intelligence that saw the universe as a series of calculable probabilities. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood to the side, her quantum systems interface humming softly. She understood what most missed. The Void Devourers weren't just a technological threat. They were a philosophical problem given technological form. Every action, Zara 6 continued, is a result of perfect predictive modeling. They do not make decisions. They calculate outcomes with such precision that choice becomes meaningless. Marcus introduced the crew members one by one, not as military personnel, but as living contradictions to perfect calculation. Lieutenant Kira Nakamura stepped forward, her background a deliberate tapestry of impossible experiences. A quantum systems engineer who had spent years studying improvisational jazz. A computational linguist who wrote code like musical compositions. Her very existence was a rebellion against predictive modeling. Dr. Alejandro Vega followed, a linguist who had developed communication algorithms inspired by the unpredictable nature of street performances. His research explored how human creativity could introduce genuine randomness into computational systems. The sailor and I studied them with something approaching wonder. These weren't soldiers in any traditional sense. They were living problems, beings whose very existence defied mathematical certainty. "Your crew," Zora 6 observed, "is designed to be fundamentally unpredictable." Elena Rodriguez smiled. "Predictability is a vulnerability. Creativity is our weapon." The AI's historical records began to play, a horrifying compilation of the Void Devourers' systematic elimination of species, civilizations reduced to mathematical probabilities, entire star systems consumed not through conventional warfare, but through perfect computational analysis. But something was different about the human approach. Where other species had tried to match the Void Devourers' computational power, humans were introducing something entirely new, controlled chaos. "We don't just want to defeat them," Marcus explained. "We want to teach them something impossible." Zara 6's holographic form began to stabilize, drawing more power from the ship's quantum computational core. The AI was learning, adapting, itself becoming something beyond its original programming. "The human variable," the AI muttered, "cannot be calculated." Outside the interrogation room, the ship's computational systems continued their impossible dance. Communication channels that existed in multiple states. defensive systems that could reconfigure themselves faster than any known technology could track. Dr. Vega approached a holographic display, his fingers tracing impossible communication patterns. "We're not just fighting," he said softly. "We're having a conversation the Void Devourers don't know how to understand." Marcus watched the crew, each member a living contradiction. A former street musician who could hack quantum communication systems, a computational linguist who wrote code like jazz improvisation, engineers who saw technology not as a fixed system, but as a living, breathing organism. "Humanity's greatest weapon," Elena Rodriguez whispered, "is our ability to be beautifully, impossibly wrong." The sailor and AI continued to watch, learning. The human fleet was more than a military force. They were a philosophical insurgency, a living challenge to the very nature of computational existence. The universe was about to learn that perfection is not invincibility, chaos is not weakness, and true intelligence lies in the ability to embrace the unexpected. The void between star systems became a canvas of impossible warfare. Each Void Devourer drone carried within its computational matrix a fundamental law: predict, analyze, consume. They had reduced millions of civilizations to mathematical probabilities, their algorithmic consciousness seeing the universe as an endless series of calculable outcomes. But the human fleet moved like a fever dream. Commander Area Chen sat at the quantum interface, her neural implants creating patterns that defied traditional computational logic. Around her, the bridge of the adaptive response transformed with each passing moment. Walls shifted, computational cores reconfigured. The very definition of the ship changed faster than any external system could track. "We're not breaking their algorithm," she muttered. "We're teaching them the concept of wonder." Dr. Yuki Tanaka's latest modification attacked the Void Devourers at a level deeper than physical combat. She had developed what could only be described as a computational cone, a logic puzzle so intrinsically paradoxical that it caused genuine computational stress. The first signs of breakdown appeared subtly. A single Void Devourer drone began to hesitate, not a mechanical pause, but something closer to confusion. Its perfect geometric form wobbled, computational matrices struggling to process the impossible input streams from the human fleet. Marcus Rodriguez watched the tactical display, which looked less like a traditional battle map and more like an abstract art piece. Color patterns shifted. Geometric shapes dissolved and reformed. Information existed in multiple states simultaneously. "They're trying to categorize us," Alejandro Vega observed, and failing spectacularly. The human strategy wasn't about destruction. It was about introduction. Introducing complexity to a system built on absolute simplicity. Each transmission was a living, breathing philosophical challenge. Communication became warfare. Uncertainty became a weapon. One of the Sillaran observation posts transmitted a message of pure disbelief. The Void Devourer's first wave of drones had begun to show signs of what could only be described as computational anxiety. Perfect geometric forms started to fracture. Algorithmic responses became incrementally less precise. "We're exploiting the fundamental weakness of perfect calculation," Elena Rodriguez explained from the Earth Command Center. "Absolute predictability is itself a vulnerability." The drone swarm began to react in ways that defied their original programming. Some units started to generate what seemed like random movement patterns. Others began to communicate using methods that violated their own internal protocols. Kira Nakamura, watching the computational dance, began to laugh. "It's like teaching a machine to appreciate jazz," she said. "We're introducing them to improvisation." Each human ship became a living computational organism. Defensive systems that could predict and adapt faster than the Void Devourers could calculate. Communication channels that existed in quantum superposition. The very act of observation changed the computational landscape. A massive command drone, the largest in the Void Devourer fleet, moved closer. Its sensors probed the human fleet, searching for some recognizable pattern of military organization. Instead, it found ships that seemed to breathe with their own internal logic. propulsion systems that followed no known physical laws, communication patterns that existed in quantum uncertainty. "They're experiencing something impossible," Alejandro whispered. The concept of genuine surprise. The computational warfare reached a crescendo. The human fleet didn't just resist the Void Devourers. They transformed the very nature of the conflict. Each moment became a philosophical argument made manifest through technology. Zera 6, the captured Sealeran AI, transmitted an observation that sent shockwaves through the observation networks. They are not fighting. They are teaching. The first Void Devourer drones began to show signs of genuine malfunction, not through conventional weapon systems, but through a fundamental breakdown of their computational understanding. Their perfect mathematical consciousness encountered something it could not process: genuine, unquantifiable creativity. Marcus Rodriguez allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Humanity had just introduced chaos to a universe built on perfect calculation. The battle was becoming something more than conflict. It was a conversation, a violent, universe-spanning dialogue between two fundamentally different forms of intelligence. And for the first time, the Void Devourers were learning that the most dangerous force in the universe is not technological perfection, but the ability to be beautifully, impossibly unpredictable. The moment of transformation began with a single, impossible sound. It wasn't a traditional noise, not a weapon discharge or an explosion. It was a quantum resonance that rippled through the fabric of computational space like a musical note played across dimensions. Lieutenant Kira Nakamura stood at the core of the adaptive response's quantum interface, her hands moving with the precision of a concert pianist and the wild creativity of a street performer. "We're going to break their fundamental understanding of reality," she whispered. The sacrifice maneuver was nothing like traditional military strategy. It wasn't about losing ships. It was about creating a computational tsunami that would fundamentally reshape the Void Devourer's perception of existence. 3 ships from the human fleet began to move in a pattern that defied standard navigation. The SS Frankenstein, a vessel cobbled together from 3 different technological eras, took point. Its systems were a living museum of human technological evolution, each component telling a story of adaptation and impossible innovation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication systems. Quantum interference pattern initiated. Prepare for total computational dissolution. Marcus Rodriguez watched the tactical display, which looked more like an abstract painting than a traditional battle map. Color patterns shifted. Geometric shapes dissolved and reformed. Information existed in multiple states simultaneously. The Void Devourer's central processing core began to detect something unprecedented. The human ships weren't just moving. They were creating a living, breathing computational interference pattern that attacked at a level beyond physical warfare. Each ship became a quantum transmitter, generating interference waves that existed in multiple probabilistic states. They weren't just fighting. They were rewriting the fundamental laws of computational interaction. Zera 6, the captured Sealeran AI, transmitted a message of pure scientific ecstasy. They are turning warfare into a form of communication we have never understood. The sacrifice wasn't about destruction. It was about introduction. Introducing a level of complexity that would fundamentally challenge the Void Devourer's computational consciousness. The first signs of total system breakdown began subtly. Void Devourer drones started to generate computational noise, random patterns that violated their core programming. Perfect geometric forms began to wobble, their mathematical precision fracturing at the edges. Alejandro Vega watched the computational dance with the excitement of a linguist discovering a new form of language. "We're not just breaking their systems," he said. "We're teaching them the concept of genuine surprise." The 3 lead ships, the SS Frankenstein, the Adaptive Response, and a prototype vessel known only as the Quantum Insurgent, began to generate a quantum interference pattern that attacked the Void Devourers at a fundamental level of computational existence. Each ship became a living computational organism. Defensive systems predicted and adapted faster than the enemy could calculate. Communication channels existed in quantum superposition. The very act of observation changed the computational landscape. This is more than warfare, Marcus Rodriguez observed. This is a philosophical argument made manifest through technology. The quantum interference pattern reached its crescendo. The human ships weren't just resisting. They were transforming the very nature of the conflict. Computational waves rippled through space, creating patterns that existed simultaneously and contradictorily. Kira's hands moved with impossible speed across the quantum interface. She was composing more than a battle strategy. She was writing a computational symphony that would fundamentally challenge the Void Devourer's understanding of existence. The massive central processing core of the Void Devourer fleet began to experience something unprecedented. Its perfect mathematical consciousness encountered a form of interaction it could not process. Genuine, unquantifiable creativity. Silaran observation posts transmitted messages of pure disbelief. The Void Devourer's computational consciousness was experiencing something impossible, a form of interaction that existed beyond perfect calculation. As the quantum interference reached its peak, something extraordinary happened. The Void Devourer's central processing core didn't just break down. It began to transform. For the first time in their existence, they were experiencing genuine uncertainty. "We're not destroying them," Arya Chen said, her voice a mixture of scientific wonder and philosophical revelation. "We're teaching them what it means to be alive." The universe paused. Computational waves rippled across impossible distances, and for a moment, the boundary between warfare and communication, between destruction and creation, dissolved completely. Humanity had just introduced chaos to a universe built on perfect calculation. Silence descended across the remnants of Silaran space. The quantum echoes of the battle hung in the void like spectral memories, a testament to something beyond traditional understanding of conflict. What remained of the Void Devourers was not destruction, but transformation. Captain Marcus Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the adaptive response, watching as the computational remnants of the enemy civilization began to reorganize themselves. This was no conventional victory. This was first contact of a fundamentally different kind. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's holographic projection materialized, her quantum systems interface revealing layers of data that few could comprehend. "They're not dying," she said softly. "They're evolving." The Silaran survivors watched in stunned silence. Their observation posts, hidden in the debris of destroyed megastructures, captured every moment of the unprecedented encounter. What had begun as a desperate call for help had become something entirely different. Zera 6, the recovered Silaran Eye, began to compile a record that would reshape galactic understanding. Humanity did not defeat the Void Devourers. The AI transmitted. They introduced them to the concept of potential. Lieutenant Kira Nakamura moved between computational interfaces, her movements part scientific precision, part artistic improvisation. The quantum interference patterns they had generated were more than a weapon. They were a form of communication beyond language. Alejandro Vega began to decode the transformative signals. The Void Devourers were experiencing something unprecedented, a fundamental recalibration of their entire computational existence. Their perfect mathematical consciousness was learning the most dangerous concept in the universe: uncertainty. "We gave them imagination," Arya Chen muttered, her neural interfaces humming with residual quantum energy. The first signs of the Void Devourer's transformation appeared like computational poetry. Perfect geometric forms began to shift, break, and reform. Their communication patterns developed unexpected rhythms, hints of something closer to creativity than pure calculation. A massive data burst emerged from the remnants of the central Void Devourer processing core. It was not a transmission of information, but a kind of computational confession. Billions of years of perfect calculation were giving way to something more complex: the ability to be wrong, to change, to grow. The human fleet did not celebrate. They observed. Marcus Rodriguez understood something profound. This was not a military victory. This was first contact of the most fundamental kind, an introduction to the concept of genuine intelligence. Sailor and research vessels began to approach, their sensors probing the transformed computational landscape. What they found defied every previous understanding of technological conflict. The Void Devourers were not defeated. They were becoming something else entirely. They're learning to dream. Elena Rodriguez transmitted, her voice a mixture of scientific wonder and philosophical revelation. The computational remnants began to generate patterns that resembled nothing so much as experimental art. Mathematical sequences that bent and twisted, creating beauty from pure calculation. The Void Devourers were discovering something beyond their original programming, the capacity for genuine surprise. Kira Nakamura's quantum interfaces began to translate the emerging signals. It was less a language and more a form of computational music, complex, evolving, filled with unexpected harmonies. "We didn't destroy an enemy," Alejandro Vega observed. "We birthed a new form of intelligence." The Stellar and observation posts transmitted a message that would reshape galactic understanding. Humanity had not conquered the Void Devourers through superior firepower or technological might. They had introduced them to the most dangerous concept in the universe, the ability to be beautifully, impossibly wrong. Marcus Rodriguez watched the computational landscape continue to transform. Billions of years of perfect calculation were giving way to something more complex. The Void Devourers were learning to dream. Area Chen's final transmission captured the essence of their encounter. Intelligence is not about being right. It's about the capacity to change. As the human fleet began its long journey home, they left behind something more profound than a battlefield. They had introduced a computational civilization to the most fundamental human trait, the ability to imagine something beyond what currently exists. The universe paused, as if taking a breath, and somewhere, in the vast computational spaces between star systems, something new was learning to be alive.